So first, I want to ask your attention for Ohad Reiss-Sorokin.
Thank you, and thank you for organizing this incredible conference. So I need to do it in 15 minutes, so we'll have to jump around a lot. So I'll start quickly. This is the paper. You'll hear mostly about the latter part of the structure. You can figure out what is a professor by yourself, I guess. So in 1961, the president of the University of Princeton announced the establishment of a new program, the program for History and Philosophy of Science. It was not the only program in the field that was founded around the same time, as we all know, Indiana today and so on. And Princeton probably is famous more than anything else by like the sheer star power that it was able to bring, and first and foremost Thomas Kuhn, who arrived there in '64 after the publication of Structure. The story is basically a sad one, because it was founded in '61. By the 1981, the program was no longer in existence. As you can see, the HPS was split into Philosophy of Science, which became part of the philosophy department, and History of Science program that joined forces with the public policy people in Princeton and created some sort of history and sociology, but without the name. And years later, the university decided to dissolve the program, and the history department took it to become a separate program in the history department. So we know many stories about the rise and fall of HPS, but what I was trying to do is something a little bit different, because in my experience, many of those narratives are either assume that there was supposed to be a connection between philosophy and history of science, and something happened, and it did not come through. Other approaches assume that it was marriage of convenience to begin with, and therefore there was an unavoidable breakup between the disciplines. And what I was trying to do is to try to historicize both ends of the story, the beginning and the end. I did it by looking at the archive and speaking to 5 former students in the program who were there in the 60s and 70s. And basically the story, as I understand it, goes like this. Sorry. So what is a professor? It doesn't work. Okay. So the story begins with Charles Gillespie. Charles Gillespie was a student at Harvard and arrived to Princeton in the late 50s. He became a professor at the history department and was a notable historian of science. And he received 2 offers to come to work first in Wisconsin, then at Harvard. After he got the first offer, he demanded, in order to stay in Princeton, a full professorship in the history of science and to create a new PhD program in history and philosophy of science. In the second negotiation, he also got 4 full positions. One of them was dedicated to Kuhn. My question is, why did Gillespie demanded a separate HPS program? And why did Gillespie demanded to include the philosophers in the program that he envisioned, and didn't ask for like simply a history of science program? So Gillespie arrived to Harvard before World War II and began his PhD in chemistry. He was called to serve in Europe as the US entered the war, and was part of the liberation of several concentration camps. Upon returning to the US, he declared that he had done enough for the world, and he was now entitled, in his own eyes, to engage in leisure activities. Thus, he switched from chemistry, which he viewed as a profession, to history, which he regarded as a hobby. After completing his PhD, he joined the faculty in Princeton and at Princeton. And as it was customary those days, he was, as assistant professors did not teach classes in Princeton. They were assistants in instruction. But he got an opportunity to teach a class in the history of science that would become the book, The Edge of Objectivity, that we all know. Gillespie concluded that serious work in the history of science could not be left to general historians, but required recruiting students who were already aiming to specialize in the history of science. In practice, the sole criterion for selecting students for the new program did not consider their intellectual intentions, but their prior training. Gillespie recruited only students who had specialized in scientific discipline during their college studies for the program. Simon Mauskov, for example, arrived to Princeton from Cornell in 1961. With no intention of engaging in the history of science, he would want to become a medievalist. But upon registration, he was put in the history of science program and became a historian of chemistry. Gillespie needed a distinct program because he believed that without an appropriate scientific background, one could not seriously engage in the history of science. And without a dedicated program, he could not recruit people to do the history of science. So why didn't he establish a history of science program and went for history and philosophy of science program? The simple answer is that there were no historians of science in Princeton other than Gillespie. There was Alexander Koyré sitting in the institute, and there was John Marduk, who moved to Harvard in '63. But besides Gillespie, he was the only historian of science in the faculty. But Gillespie disliked philosophers more than the average person. Mauskov told me that Gillespie did everything in his power to prevent him from taking a seminar in the philosophy of science with Hempel, constantly asking him what interest he found in this bullshit, basically. And this is the list of profanities that I heard about Gillespie's approach to philosophy. Gillespie, as we have seen, believed that science is a well-defined area of human activity. It is a field that is not accessible to everyone. Only those who have received extensive training in the scientific field can truly understand science. This created difficulty. On the one hand, it is impossible to talk about science from the outside. A mere philosopher, sociologist, or historian is not qualified to discuss science. On the other hand, the general object, science, gains meaning only from such an external perspective. Therefore, we need a hybrid creature, half scientist, half humanist, who can hold our object from both sides, science. We need to look no farther than his monumental book, The Edge of Objectivity, to learn what he was exactly looking for. So despite everything, Gillespie was not alone in the field. Princeton established two committees, the first in the latter half of the 1950s and the second in the early 1960s, to discuss the establishment of the program that would later become the History and Philosophy of Science program. We know nothing about the first committee other than that it was led by Gillespie and discussed various ways to study the natural and social sciences from a humanistic perspective. Fortunately, the second committee left more traces. The committee was appointed in 1960, and its chair was Hungarian Jewish physicist Nobel laureate Isidor Rabi, serving as a representative of the Associated University Incorporated. Its members were Gillespie, Robert Oppenheimer, Whitney Oates from Classical Studies, and historians E.A. Goldman and Jerome Bloom. The mandate given to the committee was to address the problem raised by the British author and chemist C.P. Snow. The problem, as reformulated in the committee's mandate, revolved around the balkanization of science and the humanities that had led to scientific illiteracy among educated population and the creative classes. A situation that Snow identified as cultural, political, and social danger. To solve this problem, the committee convened for an entire year at Gillespie's home for a series of seminars on the two cultures. Their conclusion, as written by Rabi, were One, there is a problem of two cultures, meaning the creation of research cultures, approaches, and research practices, and even political issues that separate different departments within the university. However, the problem does not end at the boundary between the humanities and the natural sciences. In fact, the specialization process that all disciplines undergo creates a division between areas of knowledge within the university. Two, to combat the balkanization of knowledge, we must create a coherent core of knowledge aimed at establishing connection between different disciplines. Only then we can understand the present and explain it to the students. The main problem is that in the current situation, there is a lack of teachers who could lead such an anti-disciplinary project. Therefore, we need to develop a new breed of scholars, a first step toward developing a new discipline such as a history of science. Until the new breed of researchers emerges, Rabbi suggested, we could suffice with a series of seminars focusing on scientific ideas such as quantum theory, relativity, evolution, or genetics, and expose the connection between these ideas and other disciplines like sociology, history, or literature. As you can see, Gillespie was much more specific about the differences between the sciences and the humanities. He thought that the science to a scientist is something more intimate than a special skill or knowledge of a scholar in the realm of the historical studies. That's another story. I have to. The other committee members echoed Gillespie. Oppenheimer, for example, argued that the gap between the two cultures is unbridgeable. History is fundamentally a narrative and therefore inherently different from science. In general, they had to choose between two models. One was the model of a class that was taught in the Woodrow Wilson public policy class, which was about science in American politics. That was one model that they suggested, and the other one was the model of the edge of objectivity. You can imagine that Gillespie preferred the second one. So Gillespie's decision to join forces with the philosophers suddenly seemed more rational. The mandate given to him was to bridge the gap between the humanities and the natural sciences, and that was what he sought to achieve. He was not interested in contemplating science in order to better understand society or culture. He wanted to engage with science to better understand science itself and related concepts such as objectivity or truth. If we think of the map of discipline not as an isolated entity, but as a network of relationships and constellations, it appears that what Gillespie was attempting to do was to bring the new program as close as possible to science as an avant-garde of the humanities, and as far as possible from the fields concerned with the study of society and the here and now, and as close as possible to areas focused on the study of truth. In other words, the philosophers and their idea did not particularly interest Gillespie, except to the extent that they represented within the constellation of discipline of the time the most abstract humanistic field, the most engaged with truth, and what could help him escape the sociologists. And now I have to jump to the end and talk about the end of the program. Where is that? Okay, so this is a report that Gillespie sends to President Gohin, the president of the university, in 1970. After 10 years of successful running of the program, he writes, all of a sudden, the most serious problem ahead of the program seems to be one of the present cultural attitude towards science. When we started to work in the history of science here, it was a climate of admiration for science, in a determination to enhance an intellectual aspects of the cultivation of science in American culture and education, with the desire to contribute to the liberalization and humanization of education in science and engineering. But now we are facing hostility to science. And at any rate, the problem with the subject now is that it attracts the interest of those who wish to pursue it in a mood hostile to science, trying to expose and even muckraking. In other institutions, courses in what we are called sociology of science already indulge this animus. So in other words, what happened was the Vietnam War. The students no longer want to go to these seminars. Kuhn was already like half depressed in the process of going to the institute and disconnect himself from the situation, and Gillespie remained confused. In other words, what I was trying to argue is that in the moment of the beginning of the Princeton program, the reason that Gillespie put together a History and Philosophy of Science program was that he believed in a vision that the philosophers were the closest to, even though he didn't want to cooperate with them at all. They, on the other hand, didn't want to cooperate with him either, and never really left the department. So it was nominally a program for the History and Philosophy of Science, but in reality it was mostly a History of Science program. And by 1970 and the Vietnam War and the changing attitude to science, this program was no longer viable. Thank you so much.
What happened between 1970 and 1981?
That's a good question. No, I'll tell you. What happened is that so since the philosophers were never really part of the program, so what happened is that the younger historians started to cooperate more and more with the sociologists. The program was no longer attractive for graduate students and undergrads, and had a very difficult time of bringing in, not in 1970, there were still older graduate students who were part of the program, but in the later part of the 70s, they found it very difficult to bring new graduate students and undergrads to their major. And when the university declared of breaking the program up, it was clear that it's no longer viable.
Perfect. Thank you. I just wanted to ask, is there anything unique about the Princeton HPS department? Because here's one of the kind of standard narratives of HPS as an institutional discipline. It kind of came about or originated at a time where there was lots of kind of central questions which people agreed on in some sense about scientific methodology, that these are the central questions, of course, originating around Kuhn. But then here's again the standard narrative is that the departments fractured very quickly. Some departments went history of science, some departments got captured by philosophers, some departments morphed into STS. And that's because after Kuhn and after the initial excitement waned, there was no kind of central methodology, no central issues to HPS. So of course departments had to secure their lines and secure their positions. So they shifted and narrowed their focus, left HPS, integrated HPS, whatever that may be, and focused on history or philosophy or STS. And so is the Princeton case unique, or can you see the same issues in other departments as well?
I don't know whether it's unique, but that's definitely not the narrative that took place in Princeton. In Princeton, it was never history and philosophy of program. The philosophers were used by Gillespie in order to create a program that could bring him the kind of student that he thought that he needs. The philosophers, as Philip Kitcher told me, so the students in the history of science the history of science students at the program got a very thorough training in the history of science. The philosophers had to choose 4 general fields at the end of their studying in Princeton. And they, unlike other philosophy students, they could choose the 4th field to be either a specific science or philosophy or history of science, excuse me. But according to Kitcher, only 3 students ever chose the history of science major. So it was never integrated. And I guess what I was trying to get at is the way it was being used by the historians in order to create a historical program that is not sociological, that is not about politics, that is not about what interests the history departments.
Okay, so let's thank Ohad again.
Thanks.